It would be really nice if I had some sort of insight into how my React application is performing in production, and the React Profiler component allows me to get that insight. So I'm going to wrap the React Profiler component around my entire application right here. So we'll say React Profiler, and we'll put everything inside of there. And then the React Profiler component accepts an ID. We'll call this app root to differentiate it from other React Profiler components. And it also accepts an onRender, which is a function. And I'm just going to take those args and we'll console.log those args here. So now I can come over to my application. We'll go to our console and oh my goodness, we've got a bunch of renders here. Let's log out and we'll do a refresh. So we've got a mount and a couple of updates as soon as our application renders. And these updates are probably happening from our auth provider trying to go get the user's information and that sort of thing. But we're going to get a log for each one of the renders of our application, which we can then send to a backend server, save that in a time series database, and then pull it up in some graphing tool. So you'll notice every single interaction is going to trigger a couple of these updates. And after a while, it actually starts to get a little bit overwhelming. And while we get the ID and the phase and a couple of these other numbers that we'll talk about here in a second, I'm not sure it's giving us enough information to actually be valuable. For example, why is this a 2 and this such a lower number? Or here we've got a 4 right here. What does that difference actually mean? And how could I interpret this in a useful way? So maybe instead of having a single React profiler for our entire application, we'll put it in several places. And we also probably want to have something that handles sending this to a backend. So that's what we're going to build in our profiler. And as part of the profiler API that I want to be able to import a profiler component. That's my own profiler component. So I'll pull it from the components profiler module. And then instead of React.profiler, we'll use our own. We can still provide an ID, but we'll have the profiler handle the onRender for us. And for my app root, I only really care about the mount phase. So we'll say phases mount. And we'll just have this one ignore update phases. So with that profiler component in place, let's make that component. Profiler. This will take that phases as a custom prop for our own wrapper of the React profiler. And then we'll take the rest of the props, which we'll forward on to react.profiler. And here let's import React from React, and we'll export the profiler. So now we need to handle the onRender here, and we'll make a function called report profile, which we'll define right here, report profile. And here are the arguments that onRender gets called with. It gets called with an ID, and this is the ID prop of the profiler, the phase, whether this is the mount or update, the actual duration, and this is the time spent rendering the committed update. Here's the base duration, and this is kind of an estimated time to render the entire subtree without memoization. So it should give us an idea of how our optimizations are performing. This is a start time, and this is the time when React began rendering this update from the initial mount of our application. Here's the commit time. So this is the time after the start time when React actually updated the DOM, which is called the commit, and then interactions, which we'll learn a little bit more about later in a future extra credit. So what do we do with all of this information? Well, we want to send it to a backend, but we probably don't want to send it as it comes in because React can re-render stuff very quickly and we don't want to clog the network tab. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'll make a queue of these things, and then I'll make a function called sendProfileQueue, which will send all of this to our profile endpoint on our backend. So if we don't have anything in the queue, then we'll just return a resolved promise with success of true, and we won't bother calling the backend. Otherwise, we'll grab the queue to send, which will just be a copy of the queue, and then we'll reassign the queue to a new empty array, and then we'll return a call to the client to the profile endpoint, and the data that we want to send is that queue to send. So then of course we'll need this client from utils API client, and then we'll just have this profile queue get called every 5 seconds or so. So we'll call set interval, send profile queue every 5 seconds. And then in our report profile function, we just need to take all of this stuff and add it to the queue. So we'll say queue.push, and we'll add it as properties on this object. But we don't want to do that if we've been instructed on which phases to send to the backend. And for this one, we just want to worry about the mount phase. So I'm going to come back in here. We'll say if phases has not been specified, or if it has been, then we'll say phases includes the phase that this report profile is getting called with. So if that's the case, then we'll go ahead and add this to the queue, which 5 seconds later will get sent along to the profile endpoint of our backend. So let's try this out. We should get a network request 5 seconds after the start of our app, and there it is. It's a post, and here's the data that we posted. We have all of that information sent off to the backend, which will hopefully put it in some time series database for us to graph later. Let's stop here really quick and review what we've done. So we wanted to get a little bit of insight into how long it takes for our entire application to mount at the very start. React exposes this capability with the React.profiler component, but we wanted to control that a little bit further, and so we made our own profiler component here, which has a report profile that takes all of the arguments that report profile gets and pushes them onto a queue, and every 5 seconds, we send that queue to our backend API at the profile endpoint.